This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia Pacific region. Stupid is as stupid does in South Korea with the MERS crisis. The United States cyber defense shield now extends over Japan. And what is being done about the migrant crisis in Southeast Asia? Plus more to ensure maritime security in the South China Sea, Hong Kong's democracy, and more. We're going to begin this week with an update on the South Korean MERS crisis and separate some of the facts from hysteria. First, let's begin with some of the crazier stories this week. A woman, while under MERS quarantine, broke it and opted to play a round of golf. Then there was the doctor who also broke quarantine and is said to have possibly infected some 1,500 people. Now, it should be noted that since that story broke, the doctor pushed back, saying the facts originally reported weren't true. Then there came some of the nutty folk remedies. Making their ways around the internet were home cures like leaving cut onions around. They apparently were supposed to absorb the MERS virus. Also, blocking your nose with Vaseline, and my personal favorite, shoving kimchi up your nose. Hey, it's said to beat cancer, so why not MERS? The South Korean government really didn't help things out too much by keeping data private. It actually helped fuel the mistrust and hysteria. In fact, 10 people have been charged with spreading false information regarding what hospitals were treating MERS patients. Some of those charged were even city officials, so you can see how important some people thought that information was. According to a Real Meter poll, some 83% of South Koreans were in favor of releasing hospital data, which the government ultimately did last weekend. Events continued to be canceled across the nation. Schools in Gyeonggi province were closed, and in some cases, for an entire week. The Seoul Bike Parade was also scrapped, and this Tuesday's opening ceremony for the Seoul Queer Festival turned into an online streaming event as organizers bowed to the government requests not to have a large public gathering where MERS could be spread. Experts say the MERS virus is spreading as expected and in a very controlled manner, and, well, we could be at the disease's peak. MERS isn't likely to become a pandemic, even though South Korea is now the nation with the second most cases in the world. Now, why was there so much hysteria? Well, to be honest, the public just wasn't stopping to think about things critically. The hysteria fueled itself and wasn't helped by prominent leaders like Seoul Mayor Park Won-soon announcing that he had no confidence in the national response and declared his own war on MERS. Now, critics of Mayor Park say that he might be doing this to position himself for the next presidential election. South Korea is also forming a task force to preserve its national image rather than actually tackle how the situation got out of hand so quickly. Thus far, it's estimated some 20,000 tourists have canceled their travel plans to South Korea. And I've also seen and received a number of requests asking me if it's safe to travel in South Korea. That answer? Absolutely. Approximately 85% of those who have canceled their travel plans are from China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, probably because of a close link between MERS and SARS. Now, some cruise ships are also opting to skip ports because of the MERS crisis. This week, the Bank of Korea cut the nation's key interest rate to 1.5% in an attempt to stave off financial repercussions from the MERS crisis. President Park Geun-hye has vowed to do everything in her power to contain and eradicate the MERS virus, even postponing her planned trip to the United States. However, the main issue is that the government really has lost all credibility with the public following the botched rescue attempt at the Sewol ferry last year and how it initially responded to the MERS crisis when it was first detected. It seemed actually that the more the government tried to urge people to remain calm, the more it fueled speculation that they were trying to hide something. In fact, a national alert was ultimately sent out over the mobile phone network, urging people to exercise common sense, like washing their hands, avoiding people with symptoms, and how to properly cough. Incheon International Airport instituted screening procedures, and rightly so. Other Asian countries followed suit, with some implementing follow-up procedures with those having a cough or a fever. The WHO noted that there was nothing present that warranted issuing travel warnings, but that didn't stop Hong Kong from sending out a red alert notice to avoid South Korea. Taiwan also issued a travel alert, raising its status to yellow for South Korea, and Macau also put the peninsula on high alert. Since there were problems with quarantines, the government is looking at implementing a new GPS tracking system to make sure those who are supposed to be in isolation actually stay that way. Now, as of this recording, there have been no signs that the MERS virus has mutated to become airborne. More than 28 remain in isolation, with 122 confirmed cases and 9 fatalities. While MERS is said to be fatal about 40% of the time, in South Korea, that number is actually less than 10%. So really, don't worry and exercise common sense. The United States announced last week it would extend its cyber defense umbrella over Japan. Then, 2 days later, after that announcement, the Japan Times reported that 1.25 million sets of personal data from its pension system were leaked in a huge cyber attack. It stemmed from an employee clicking on a link inside an email. Come on, guys. You should know better than that by now. Now, joining me via Skype is Greg Austin, a cybersecurity expert and fellow at the EastWest Institute. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Steve.
So I want to get your opinion on this. The United States unveiled this new, defense cybersecurity umbrella partnership with Japan, and I wanted to get your opinion. So is this something that you think is needed? And I guess, what does it really say about Japan's ability to defend itself from cyber attacks?
Well, it's certainly needed because cyber operations and information warfare are a normal part of modern military planning these days, and it's certainly a part of the military strategy of the United States, a very big part, and becoming a very big part of the military strategy of China. So for a country like Japan, it just has to lift its game and come up to par, really.
Now, does it really say anything to the strength of Japan's ability to defend itself? I mean, just recently we had that huge hack in Japan 2 days after this announcement.
Well, all countries, including the United States, are subject to quite serious cybersecurity threats, and even the United States has proven incapable of defending itself against serious attack in the civil sector. And just this week there was news that Pentagon assets were hacked with leak of or compromise of significant amounts of personnel data.
With regard to the future, you mentioned how this is playing into different kind of military aspects across the board as we move forward to the 21st century. Do you think that we will see more types of these agreements being made, much in the same way that traditional military alliances and pacts have been formed?
Oh yes, this is definitely the trend. Information warfare is the fundamental foundation of modern warfare. The Chinese government issued a new military strategy paper just last week, which said that cyberspace and outer space are the commanding heights of international security. That's the reality, and that means that alliances have to update themselves to take account of that. That's true of the Australia-US alliance, and in 2011, both governments affirmed the proposition that the ANZUS alliance extended to cyber attack on one country or another. So NATO is undergoing a similar sort of process, although in the NATO framework it's proving difficult to mobilize an alliance-wide response on offensive operations, but so they're concentrating largely on defensive operations.
Greg Austin with the EastWest Institute, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, Steve. Thank you.
As Greg mentioned, there was a huge data breach at the Office of Personnel Management in the United States, and in fact, some people are calling that data breach unprecedented. And once more, China is suspected of carrying out that cyber attack. So I have to ask you, Will the efforts the United States is making in Japan really make a difference? I mean, if they can't protect themselves, how are they going to go about and protect another nation across the sea? What do you think? Please let me know in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Can the United States and Japan fend off cyber attacks from the internet's black hats? I have previously spoken about the Asian Migrant Crisis and the plight of those who are commonly referred to as the boat people. Towards the end of May, regional leaders met to try and get a handle on the situation. With me now on the phone is Jonah, senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation, to try and make sense of it all. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, at the end of May, the regional leaders got together to try and get a handle on the situation and devise a remedy. And unfortunately, nothing was really achieved aside from the fact that, yes, we do need to continue to discuss this and get a handle on things. Everyone recognizes something absolutely needs to be done, but what is holding back action and actually accomplishing this?
Well, the biggest reason for a lack of action is in Myanmar itself. For the immediate future, the countries in the region and the countries around the world need to step up and do more. The rich countries should be helping the frontline countries, particularly Myanmar and Indonesia, to foot the bill for this rather intensive effort. And the United States has actually stepped up to the plate with both funding and with surveillance flights to find refugees who are in danger of dying on the sea. We need to have more help from the other rich nations, both those in the region, like Australia, Japan, South Korea, China, and those further afield. This really is a global crisis rather than just a regional one. But the long-term solution really lies in Myanmar. As long as the government of Myanmar refuses to acknowledge any sort of responsibility for its own citizens and for the fact that it is driving its citizens to risk their lives on the ocean, then we're just going to have a problem that gets worse and worse.
All right, let's try to look forward and look at possible solutions. In your opinion, if we take a look at short-term, immediate things that need to take place, what could be done to, I guess, put an end to the humanitarian crisis that we're currently seeing?
Well, the frontline states, particularly Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, have to accept the refugees that are coming to their shores. That's their obligation under international law, and it's the only moral outcome. You don't turn people away who are at risk of dying. However, the rest of the world has to step up and help shoulder the burden of the cost. These are three nations that are not particularly wealthy, and the nations that do have more resources: the United States, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and further afield in Europe, have to supply funding and resources to help these frontline nations do this. That's the short-term answer. The long-term answer is to address why these people are risking everything in a tremendously desperate flight from their own country. And that's where Myanmar really has to be prodded to take the right course. Who can do the prodding? To some extent, the same rich nations that are now eager to engage with Myanmar, but more particularly ASEAN, Myanmar's neighbors within Southeast Asia. ASEAN has been very reluctant, traditionally, to interfere in the affairs of any of its member nations. However, this really will be a test of whether ASEAN has a legitimate purpose in the 21st century.
Jonah is a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you very much.
Jonah and I discussed this topic in further detail, and that complete interview is available on our website in the Asia Now podcast feed. Now, this, of course, is a very complicated issue, and there really is no simple solution. But my question for you is this: do you believe these governments can actually work together to put an end to this crisis? So by the end of this month, it's expected that the Articles of Agreement for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB, will be finalized and ready for signing. This China-led development bank also believes it will be up and running by the end of the year. So far, more than 50 countries have agreed to join this endeavor, including 16 of the world's top 20 economies. The 4 naysayers include the United States, Japan, Mexico, and Canada. Even so, the AIIB isn't the only game in town when it comes to developing this particular region, where some 40% of the population are said to be poor. Returning to the podcast is Curtis S. Chin, Asia Fellow with the Milken Institute, to help make sense of all this financial gobbledygook. Curtis, welcome back to the podcast.
Great. It's always good to be here.
Super. Now, before we dive too much into this topic, could you really briefly bring us up to date, remind us what exactly a development bank is and what purpose they serve?
Sure. Great question. It's always tough sometimes to answer these questions without using the word, say, development and bank. But a development bank is a financial institution that's really focused on improving countries, economies, people's lives, and primarily, though, through building a country's infrastructure, or improving a country's rule of law. And so these are not institutions or banks that maybe you and I can go to and pull money out from an ATM machine. Development banks are really typically owned by a country or countries and typically lend to or do projects in other countries. So it's less of a consumer bank. It's really about helping countries get better, helping them develop. Okay,
now in Asia, who are the major players when it comes to these financial institutions or development banks or what have you?
Sure. I mean, the two that really come to mind are, of course, the World Bank. That's a Washington-based institution that was really created after World War II to help really finance infrastructure and development around the world. So a major player in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, here in Asia itself, there's one based out of Manila called the Asian Development Bank. People sometimes just say the ADB, but the Asian Development Bank is sort of an Asia version of the World Bank, and like the World Bank, is owned by countries and primarily lends to countries. But you raise a question that perhaps because of the big news that's happened really this last couple weeks, which is there's a new player in town, and that would be the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. And unlike the World Bank, which is really led by the Western countries, the United States typically names the president in some ways, the Asian Development Bank also heavily influenced by Japan and the United States, and the Japanese typically name the president there. The AIIB, this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is different and perhaps a sign of a changing world and a changing Asia. It is a Chinese-initiated institution that we based out of Beijing, and based on reports, hopefully will be up and running by the beginning of next year, if not the end of this.
Right. Now, you actually have worked with the ADB before. And now we have stories coming out that the AIIB, the China-led bank, is going to work with the ADB and cooperate on the region's development. Now, I wanted to get your opinion, since you are really familiar with this. How alike, or really how dissimilar, are these two financial institutions? And, well, are they doing the exact same thing, or do they have a slightly different focus?
For the AIIB, I think, what do they say? The proof will be in the tasting of the pudding. Because, the leadership of the AIIB is still being chosen. And really, it's at a very early stage. What's happened if we take a step back? The end of March was the deadline for countries who wanted to be founding members of the AIIB to let the Chinese know that they did want to indeed join. There was a recent meeting, really in the last, 2 weeks in Singapore, where these founding members got together really to begin to work out the details. And so your question really went into the details of what will the AIIB do, how will it be similar, and how will it be different to the ADB and the World Bank. We really don't know. If we take them at their word, if we take the leadership that's there so far at their word, they are, like the World Bank and the ADB, going to focus on infrastructure. There's a tremendous need for infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific region. There's one estimate that this region, Asia, could benefit from another $800 billion a year in infrastructure investment over the next 10 years. And so I think all these banks are rightly focusing on the infrastructure gap out there. But the AIIB has also made clear that it will not be simply focused on poverty reduction, which is, of course, one of the reasons to be of both the World Bank and the ADB. It'll be a little bit more removed in that they'll certainly argue, and I do agree with them in many ways, that improving this region's infrastructure will also help fight poverty in this region.
But, I mean, okay, so if everyone essentially is doing the same thing, trying to improve countries, why have so many different entities? Why not just pool everyone's money into one group and move forward as a collective entity?
I think we have to recognize that the World Bank, the ADB, what we call bilateral, meaning one-on-one or one country to another country institutions, these really are all political institutions. And so the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, even the United Nations, of course, we all say they're here to help the world. And indeed, they are doing some marginal good, I would say. But the reality is that they are political institutions here to advance the major shareholders, their founders' goals. And so that's really one reason why there are so many of these institutions. Everyone has their own country-specific goals above and beyond the regional regions that we would all like them to get together.
Okay, now one last question. I think this is probably perhaps even the most difficult. A lot of the money that goes into these development banks comes from state parties. They make their contributions and they come from the state coffers, meaning that tax dollars are in play. So for the average person of, say, South Korea or Australia or even England, who's a member of the AIIB and United States for other monetary funds, the question that they ask is really, what's in it for me? Why not spend that money on domestic issues where it's also needed?
That's a very fair point. This time when economies are troubled, we have slow to no growth economies. People want to say, why are you sending that money outside? Why don't you help us here at home? I think it's a very fair question. Let's take a step back, though. When we think about these development banks, the reality is in many ways right now, they're kind of self-funding in that the money they lend out comes back to them to finance future operations. But you've hit the point as to should they be bigger? And if indeed they get bigger, that means indeed more money that comes from someone's tax dollars to increase the capital base. I would say to the people who have concerns, a couple things. One, you're absolutely right. We need to focus on wherever our home is and make these better places. Absolutely, I agree with that. But I also say that helping other countries also has benefits at home. Clearly when I look at the United States, my home, it's benefit from free trade, from a growing world economy. And that's also what these institutions are about, growing economies, not just in one country, but around the world. Because clearly, if we've got more consumers around the world at higher income levels, it means more products will be purchased, more trade. The other thing I'd say to people when they think about how these institutions can benefit at home. I remember when I used to testify before the U.S. Congress, one of the questions that would always come up was that very specific one. Why should we give one more dollar to whatever institution overseas? And that's where data matters. And if you look at the data, you'll see that when we put money into exports, more jobs are created at home. When we put money into a place like the Asian Development Bank, the reality is that American companies, American advisors, consultants, Americans are also benefiting. That we get more money back than we put in. But clearly, it's a very important question. But I would say it's not an either or. I believe we can focus on home and also focus on improving and increasing the impact of the World Bank, the ADB, and some of these other institutions. And that's, for me, one reason I felt that the United States, Japan, other countries choosing not to join the AIIB was a lost opportunity. Let's try and shape and influence these institutions so indeed they can do a much better job in the region.
All right. Curtis S. Chin with the Milken Institute, thank you once again for joining us.
Always great to be with you.
Now, there is, of course, a whole lot more to this conversation, and you'll be able to find it on our website, asianewsweekly.net, inside the Asia Now podcast feed. Now, before I go, I'd love to hear from you. How do you feel about governments using tax money to fund international development efforts? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. It is time once more for the Asia Brief, a collection of stories from the Asia-Pacific region you may have missed. Coming up next, security deals for the South China Sea, the showdown in Hong Kong over democracy, and much more for this week ending June 12, 2015. Ah yes, what would a week be without an update from the South China Sea? Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe traveled to Europe this past weekend to attend the G7 meeting in Germany. At the top of his agenda, China's activity in the South China Sea. His message was clear. If the world doesn't step up its game, it will spark a greater geopolitical crisis. The question does remain, what exactly will the world do? After all, China saw the lack of resolve towards Russia when it annexed Crimea. This, of course, comes on the heels of Japan and the Philippines, the nation that has been the most vocal against China's land reclamation efforts in the South China Sea, diving into a new military partnership deal. While the details haven't been exactly finalized, it is expected Japan's maritime forces will have access to ports in the Philippines and share much-needed hardware with the world's second-largest archipelago. In a joint statement, Abe and President Aquino expressed serious concern about Chinese land reclamation work in the South China Sea, warning against any unilateral actions that may cause a physical change to the maritime environment. The two nations also announced plans to hold new rounds of military drills later this month. China, in its recently released white paper, countered, citing an active defense policy in 4 different domains. They include the ocean, outer space, cyberspace, and nuclear forces. With regard to the South China Sea, China says its neighbors have taken provocative actions and illegally occupied China's sovereign territory. China continued to try and push their position that everyone else's point of view on the matter is far from factual, even carrying out their own military drills. But China isn't the only nation being accused of using force to promote their position in disputed waters. Taiwan's Coast Guard is firing back after it was accused of bullying a Filipino Coast Guard vessel. The dispute originated in contested waters ripe for fishing. The Philippines apprehended the Mingjin Kai No. 6 and was removing it from the area when a 500-ton Taiwan Coast Guard cutter arrived. 5 times larger than the Filipino vessel, you can imagine how things played out. Walter Lohman, director of the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center, said that South Korea should be more vocal against China's behavior in the South China Sea, something that was mentioned a few days before by U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Russell. The statements are seen as a way to put pressure on President Park's planned trip to Washington, D.C., but I'm not too sure that tactic is going to be too effective. South Korea relies heavily on China, especially for tourism, and isn't likely to do anything too drastic to upset that relationship. And one last note on this subject. The United States and India signed a new defense pact and a 10-year defense cooperation framework. According to the agreement, the United States will help India build and design an aircraft carrier and jet engines. Vietnam also signed an agreement with the United States to seek military hardware to better protect its maritime assets. Now, if you think a Cold War hasn't started yet in the South China Sea, these latest agreements clearly show otherwise. June 17th is a day to mark in your calendars, as the day final debate for the election of Hong Kong's next chief executive is set to begin in the Legislative Council. Sources say the government isn't going to change any portion of the plan unveiled in April or postpone the vote. In a recent poll, public opposition to the 2017 electoral plan dropped to 34.5%, with many thinking the Legislative Council should pass the measure and negotiate changes after the fact. If voting takes place along ideological lines, the measure will not pass. Should that occur, the current method of selecting the chief executive would be retained, and the march towards universal suffrage would begin anew. Hundreds of Japanese pundits urged Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to offer his own apology for Japan's wartime crimes and atrocities. They say Abe should express his resolve to honor previous formal apologies. Abe should deliver a message of remorse and apology, reaffirming Japan's invasion and colonial rule of many Asian countries, including Korea, China, and other neighboring countries, caused damage and agony for the people there. The group of 225 scholars said in a joint statement that included Wada Haruki, an emeritus professor of Tokyo University, Naoki Mizuno, professor of Kyoto University, and others who have long studied Korea-Japan relations and historical issues. Former Prime Minister Tomoichi Murayama demanded Abe honestly spell out the country's wartime actions to address growing international concern that he may revise history. Furthermore, former Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono also spoke out on Japan's use of women for sex slaves, saying, quote, "It is a clear case that the military forcefully took them and made them serve as comfort women," end quote. Sadly, the fact remains that Abe and his LDP have a firm grip of power in Tokyo, and it's unlikely that unless things become politically advantageous for him, he's likely to issue such an apology to appease critics, and more likely to cater to his core constituency. There are more stories from the region. An extended version of the Asia Brief is available on our website or in the Asia Brief podcast feed. All right, my friends, well, the podcast is winding down, but before I go, let's take a quick look at some of your comments from last week. First up, Linda Peru says, as always, thanks for the latest facts about these developing issues. Peace. Yuri Grant said I nailed it with my commentary about South Koreans and how they sometimes don't follow the most hygienic procedures. Mark Vaz on the MERS craziness said that it was imperative for people to behave rationally and to stop panicking. Dima Levena says, teleporting the true news. ISIL are extremely evil people. And Red White Dude, comparing the Eastern Star and Sewol sinking, said, while it was better organized on the ferry disaster, the Chinese regime, as usual, frustrates victims' families. This usually ends up generating anger and frustration at the regime. Not sure if all the disasters in Korea play out like that. The thing about Korea was that the cause was found out and publicized. As always, some amazing comments from you, and I truly do appreciate the time it takes to write those down, so thank you so much. Now, if you have a thought or an opinion about one of the stories I mentioned this week, please leave them in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. That is quick and easy to do, and best of all, it's free. Just go to our website, asianewsweekly.net, and click on the subscribe tab. You can also do it inside your favorite podcast application, and when you subscribe, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. Now, to get more information of what's taking place within the region, be sure to follow Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. Now, if you have a thought, a comment, or some feedback about the podcast, please shoot me an email message. That address is podcast@asianewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for your time this week, and until next time, my name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.